Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that Canada's banking system is smiling in public and screaming in private? What if the financial stability you read about in the headlines is not stability at all, but a carefully constructed illusion, engineered by the very institutions that hold your mortgage, your savings, and your future? What if the calm you feel right now is not the end of the storm, but the eye of it? Because here is the part they never put in the official reports. CIBC, one of Canada's largest and most powerful banks, has just released a report that contains a warning so significant, so structurally alarming, that its full implications have barely been discussed in mainstream financial media. The report warns that what they are calling payment shock is set to double in 2026, not grow slightly, not inch upward, double. And this is not a conspiracy. It is a stated policy consequence baked directly into the architecture of the Canadian mortgage system. And this part has already begun. Let me be precise about what we are talking about. According to the Bank of Canada, 60% of all outstanding mortgages in this country will come up for renewal by the end of 2026. 60%. That is not a niche corner of the market. That is not a small subsection of over-leveraged speculators. That is the majority, the mathematical majority of every mortgage currently active in Canada coming to the renewal wall at the same time in the same window all at once. The number is staggering. It is not theoretical. It is observable. It is already written into the term structure of every loan originated between 2020 and 2021, and the clock does not care about your feelings. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is the rate those people locked in. During the pandemic buying spree of 2020 and 2021, Canadians were told, repeatedly, officially, publicly, that interest rates would remain low for a long time. The Bank of Canada said it. The banks repeated it, and millions of Canadians, acting completely rationally in response to what they were told by the most credible financial institutions in the country, went out and bought homes with money borrowed at 1.5%, at 1.8%, at 2%. They signed 5-year fixed terms. They stretched. They bought, they believed, and now those 5-year terms are expiring, and the rate waiting for them on the other side is not 1.5%, it is 4.5%, it is 5%, in some cases higher. The bill is coming due, and it is far larger than anyone planned for. Here's the moment the clock actually starts, because we haven't even reached the breaking point yet. What I want you to understand, what the data forces as its only conclusion, is that the pain being felt right now is not the full wave. It is the leading edge. Subprime borrowers, the most financially vulnerable segment of the market, have already seen their delinquency rate climb to 11.5%, 30 or more days overdue. The CIBC report itself describes this as notably higher than pre-COVID levels. And here is what that number actually means. It is not just a data point, it is a sequence. Distress always starts at the bottom of the credit ladder and works its way up. The subprime borrowers fall first, then the renters, then the variable rate holders. And finally, in 2026, the prime mortgage holders, the people who thought they did everything right, hit the renewal wall. This is the mechanism hiding in plain sight. What I call the big secret of the entire system is a concept called extend and pretend. And it is the reason that the official numbers look far more stable than the underlying reality. Here is what it means. For the past several years, as rates began rising, banks quietly offered struggling variable rate borrowers the ability to keep their monthly payments the same, even though the interest portion of those payments had ballooned. The result was a situation where people were technically current on their loans. The delinquency numbers stayed low. The banks reported healthy portfolios. Everything looked fine from the outside, but the unpaid interest did not vanish. It was added to the principal. The debt was growing every month, quietly, invisibly. The borrower was treading water while a lead weight was being attached to their ankle. For the average household, this means they woke up one morning believing they had paid their mortgage faithfully for 3 years and discovered they owed more than when they started. That is not a mortgage. That is a trap with a pleasant monthly statement. And this is the crack that becomes an earthquake. CIBC's report now admits that for 5 to 6% of their own mortgage portfolio, payment increases could exceed 40% at renewal. 40%. Let that architecture of numbers land for a moment. A family paying $2,650 per month today would face a payment of $3,150 in 2026. That is an additional $500 per month, $6,000 per year, extracted from a household budget already compressed by 3 years of inflation, by rising grocery bills, by energy costs, by the quiet erosion of purchasing power that never makes the front page but shows up every single time you open your wallet. Here's the part nobody expects. Ontario, the geographic heart of Canada's housing market, the province with the highest concentrations of leveraged buyers, the province where median home prices spent a decade defying economic gravity, saw mortgage delinquency rates surge by 44% year over year in the second quarter of 2025 alone. 44% in a single year. In the province that everyone pointed to as proof that Canadian real estate was different, was special, was immune to the rules that governed every other housing market in the developed world. This is not a rounding error. This is the first visible fracture in the edifice, because what comes next is worse. Now let me show you what actually happened at the origin point, because to understand where we are going, you have to understand where this system was built. And it was not built in 2024 or in 2022 or even in 2008. The foundation of this crisis was poured in the winter of 2020 when the Bank of Canada reduced its policy rate to 0.25%, effectively to zero, in response to the economic shutdown triggered by the pandemic. This was, in the language of the blueprint, the birth of the carry trade for an entire generation of Canadian homeowners. For the first time in modern history, borrowing money to buy property was, in real terms, nearly free. The mortgage market became a mechanism for arbitrage. You could borrow at 1.5% and own an asset, housing, that was appreciating at 15, 20, sometimes 30% annually. The math was irresistible, and millions of Canadians, many of them buying their first home, many of them young families, many of them making the single largest financial decision of their lives, stepped into that machine. Here is what the simple logic missed, and this is where common sense actually becomes your enemy. The 5-year fixed mortgage is not just a financial instrument. It is a time capsule. It locks in not just a rate, but an entire economic reality, and then releases the borrower into a completely different one 5 years later. The Canadians who signed at 1.5% in 2020 were not being reckless. They were being rational within the reality they were handed, but the reality has changed underneath them. The scaffolding they built their financial lives upon was temporary. The Bank of Canada's emergency rates were, by definition, an emergency measure, but no one put that in the brochure. This leads us to the system's most crucial secret, which we will explore as this story continues to unfold. What the CIBC report reveals, buried beneath the measured corporate language, beneath the carefully worded guidance and the footnotes and the analyst commentary, is something that sounds almost bureaucratic, but is, in practice, a confession. The bank is restructuring its workforce. It is setting aside charges to prepare for loan losses. These are not the actions of an institution that believes its own public messaging about stability and resilience. These are the actions of an institution that has run the numbers, knows what 2026 looks like, and is quietly repositioning itself on the other side of the table. The bank is not your partner in this. It is a creditor, and it is preparing for foreclosure. We don't have months. This is happening in days. Let me cut through the noise for a moment, because this is the section that most financial commentators skip over entirely. They give you the headline number, they give you the rate comparison, and then they move on. What they don't do is show you the rot beneath the surface, the specific, named, documented evidence that this is not a forecast, not a model, not a projection. It is happening right now across multiple layers of the Canadian credit system simultaneously. And the simultaneity is exactly what makes this dangerous. This is not theoretical, it is observable. The first canary in the coal mine is the auto loan. It sounds small, it sounds unrelated. But here is the detail even analysts tend to miss. The auto loan is not a separate financial ecosystem. It is a diagnostic instrument. It tells you the exact pressure level inside a household's budget before that pressure reaches the mortgage. Think about what an auto payment represents. It is typically the second largest recurring monthly obligation a household carries after housing. It is also the most difficult to restructure. You cannot call your car lender and ask for a negative amortization arrangement. You cannot defer principal. You either pay or you default, and the car disappears. So when auto loan delinquencies begin rising sharply, you are seeing the first evidence that household budgets have already been breached, that the slack is gone, that the margin has been consumed before the mortgage renewal even arrives. And here is what that looks like on the ground. Auto loan delinquencies among younger Canadian borrowers have risen by nearly 20% year over year. 20%. That is not a seasonal fluctuation. That is a structural deterioration. These are not people who made a single bad financial decision. These are people who bought a vehicle, financed it at the rates available at the time, and are now finding that between the vehicle payment, the grocery bill, the rent or mortgage, and the residue of 3 years of accumulated inflation, there is simply no room left. The math does not work. And if the math does not work at the auto loan level, the math certainly does not work when the mortgage payment jumps by $500 in 2026. But that's not the real problem. The second canary is Generation Z. This is the part nobody expects, and the data is unambiguous. Gen Z credit card usage is growing rapidly, their balances are climbing, and their delinquency rates are climbing faster than their balances. This matters not just as a current snapshot, but as a structural indicator of what the Canadian credit system looks like in 10, 15, 20 years. The future generation of first-time home buyers, the people who would normally be expected to absorb the supply coming onto the market, to maintain price floors, to provide liquidity when existing owners need to sell, is already drowning. They are entering the housing conversation not from a position of financial strength, but from a position of credit exhaustion. They are arriving at the starting line already carrying the weight of a race they have been running since they graduated. And here is where the cascade becomes unstoppable. Because when you place these three canaries together, the subprime mortgage delinquencies at 11.5%, the auto loan deterioration at nearly 20% year over year among the young, and the Gen Z credit crunch building silently underneath the visible economy, what you are looking at is not three separate problems. What you are looking at is a contagion sequence, a progression. This is what I call the subprime creep. It does not arrive all at once. It moves. It begins at the edges of the credit system, where the most financially exposed borrowers live, and it migrates inward, toward the center, toward the prime borrowers, toward the homeowners who checked every box and followed every rule and are now discovering that the rules were written for a different interest rate environment than the one they are about to renew into. This is where the first domino falls. Now let me show you the trigger event itself, because this is the part that translates everything abstract into something viscerally real. The payment shock doubling that CIBC warns about in 2026 is not a vague possibility. It is a mathematical schedule. It is embedded in the contractual renewal dates of every 5-year fixed mortgage originated in 2021. You can calculate the exact month it arrives for any given borrower. And in the second half of 2026, it arrives for millions of Canadians at once. A family whose mortgage payment was $2,050 per month at their pandemic-era rate of 1.5% will sit down to renew at something closer to 4.5% or higher and discover that their new payment is $3,050, sometimes more. That is $500 additional dollars per month, $6,000 per year, extracted from a budget that has already been running on fumes. For pensions, for families on fixed incomes, for single income households, this is catastrophic. And here is where everything changes. Because $6,000 per year multiplied across the hundreds of thousands of households hitting renewal in that same window does not stay inside individual balance sheets. It moves. It becomes an extraction from the broader consumer economy. Every dollar that exits a household's discretionary spending budget to cover a higher mortgage payment is a dollar that does not go to a restaurant, a retailer, a local service business. It is a dollar that does not go into a savings account, does not fund a home renovation, does not get spent on the small and medium-sized enterprises that form the backbone of the Canadian economic fabric. The mortgage renewal crisis of 2026 is not just a housing crisis. It is a consumption shock, a demand cliff, and the economy has no mechanism to replace that spending. Here's the part the experts gloss over. The Bank of Canada knows this. The lenders know this. The analysts at CIBC who wrote this report know this. The question is not whether the payment shock arrives. The question is whether the systemic response, the rate cuts, the restructuring programs, the government interventions can arrive fast enough and with sufficient force to absorb the impact. And here is why that question has a deeply uncomfortable answer. Rate cuts, even meaningful ones, do not solve this problem. This is the counterintuitive pivot that you need to sit with for a moment. Even if the Bank of Canada cuts rates aggressively between now and 2026, Even if the policy rate drops to 3.5%, which would represent a significant reduction from current levels, a borrower renewing from 1.5% to 3.5% is still more than doubling their effective interest burden. The simple logic that rate cuts will save us does not apply here. The gap is too large. The base rate from which these renewals are coming is too low. There is no cut deep enough to close that gap entirely. There is no path that returns to 1.5%. The era of free money is over, and the hangover has just begun. This is not a prediction, it's math. Now I want to show you the encirclement, because one of the things that makes this particular crisis architecturally different from previous housing downturns is that the conventional exits have been blocked. In a normal housing correction, a borrower facing payment pressure has options. They can sell, they can refinance, they can access equity. Each of those options becomes progressively less reliable in the environment we are now entering. Selling into a market where hundreds of thousands of other stressed borrowers are simultaneously attempting to sell is not a strategy. It is a stampede. Supply hits the market at exactly the moment when the pool of qualified buyers, remember Gen Z, remember the auto loan borrowers, has been substantially depleted by their own credit deterioration. The price discovery that follows is not orderly, it is a ratchet. Prices reset lower, which destroys the equity cushion of the very sellers who are counting on that equity to pay down the balance and make the renewal number bearable. And here is where the cascade becomes unstoppable. Refinancing offers no escape either, because the refinanced rate carries the same problem as the renewed rate. It is dramatically higher than the rate being escaped from. Unless the borrower can absorb a payment increase at renewal, they almost certainly cannot absorb one at refinancing either, because the math is identical. The rate environment is the constraint, and refinancing does not alter the rate environment. What I call the big secret of the entire system is what happens when these three escape routes close simultaneously. The liquidity tide is going out, and we are about to find out who has been swimming naked. For the average household, this means the moment of reckoning is not abstract. It is a specific month. It is a specific renewal date on a specific document signed in 2021. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the second half of 2026 when the lender's renewal offer arrives in an email. And on that Tuesday, the choice is not between a good option and a bad one. It is between levels of financial pain, between restructuring now and defaulting later, between selling voluntarily and being foreclosed upon involuntarily, between a difficult conversation with a mortgage broker and a devastating one with a bankruptcy trustee. This is the moment small businesses get crushed. Because the business owner who also carries a residential mortgage, the contractor whose cash flow depends on homeowners having disposable income for renovations, the retailer whose foot traffic depends on a neighborhood of financially stable households, all of them are downstream from the same renewal wave. The residential mortgage system is not a silo, it is a circulatory system. When it constricts, everything connected to it feels the pressure. We haven't even reached the breaking point yet. Let me give you the forensic evidence, the specific, named, documented case that proves the rot is real and not theoretical. CIBC is not just issuing a warning report and moving on. The bank is actively restructuring its workforce. It is taking what the corporate filings call charges, accounting language for anticipated losses, for the pre-positioning of capital against expected defaults. This is not the language of an institution that believes the problem will self-correct. This is the behavior of an institution that has modeled the 2026 renewal cohort, assessed the percentage that cannot absorb a 40% payment increase, and is now building the infrastructure to process what comes next. The legal teams, the loan restructuring units, the collections frameworks, these things take time to build. You do not build them in response to a problem. You build them in anticipation of one. A default in all but name is already being priced into the system, and the 44% delinquency surge in Ontario is not a warning sign on the horizon. It is confirmation that the leading edge of the wave has already made landfall. Ontario was not chosen randomly as the province where this shows up first. Ontario is where the most extreme version of the pandemic-era price appreciation occurred. It is where the gap between what people borrowed and what the underlying economic fundamentals could support was the widest. It is where the scaffolding was built the tallest, on the narrowest foundation, and now the fault line is visible, 44% in a single year, in the nation's economic engine, and this is the crack that becomes an earthquake. Friends, let me bring everything together now. Because we have walked through the origin of this system, we have identified the canaries, we have traced the contagion sequence, and we have watched the escape routes close one by one. And what we are left with, what the data forces as its only conclusion, is a convergence, not one problem, not two. Three distinct structural forces arriving in the same window at the same time, compressing against the same population of borrowers from three different directions simultaneously. Let me be precise. The first force is the 2026 renewal wall. 60% of all outstanding Canadian mortgages renewing in a single calendar window, the majority of them originated at rates between 1.5% and 2%, renewing into an environment of 4.5% and above. This is not a possibility. This is a contractual schedule. It is written into documents that have already been signed. It cannot be negotiated away. The renewal wall does not care about rate cut expectations, does not respond to government reassurances, does not move because an economist appeared on television to say that the fundamentals remain sound. It arrives in the second half of 2026 with the indifference of mathematics. The second force is the subprime deterioration already underway. An 11.5% delinquency rate among the most financially vulnerable borrowers, already elevated above pre-pandemic levels, already climbing, tells us that the credit system's immune response is failing at its perimeter. And what I call the big secret of the entire system is that perimeter failures do not stay contained at the perimeter. They migrate. The subprime creep is not a metaphor. It is a documented historical pattern that preceded every major credit crisis of the last 40 years. The subprime borrower is not a separate species. They are the leading indicator. They are the household that is 6 months ahead of the prime borrower on the same road. And here is where the cascade becomes unstoppable. The third force is the broader economic slowdown, rising unemployment, compressed consumer spending, the demand cliff created by $6,000 per year per household being redirected from the economy into the gap between the old mortgage payment and the new one. This is the force that makes the other two forces worse, because in a strong labour market, a borrower facing a payment increase can, at minimum, work more hours, take a second job, liquidate savings built up in a period of growth. But an economic slowdown removes those pressure valves. It arrives at exactly the wrong moment, as if the system designed the timing deliberately. Unemployment rises at the same moment the renewal bill arrives. Income growth stalls at exactly the point where the budget required it to accelerate. This was inevitable the moment the pandemic rates were written into 5-year terms. Now, I want to stop talking about the numbers for a moment, because the numbers are almost beside the point at this stage. The numbers are just the quantification of something deeper, a psychological architecture that is about to be dismantled, and the dismantling of which will be as disorienting as any financial event in a generation. And here is the counterintuitive pivot that I think is the most important thing I can say to you today. The crisis of 2026 is not primarily a mortgage crisis. It is a psychological one. Here's the part the experts gloss over. For 30 years, Canadian real estate operated as a one-directional machine. Prices went up, equity accumulated. The home was not just a place to live. It was a financial instrument, a retirement plan, a mechanism of intergenerational wealth transfer, an ATM that never ran out of money. Canadians were not irrational to believe this. They were responding accurately to 30 years of uninterrupted evidence. The house went up. The house always went up. And that belief, that deeply conditioned, historically validated, emotionally reinforced belief, is what economists call the money illusion. You feel wealthy because the number on your property assessment grew. You feel secure because the equity position looks healthy on a spreadsheet. But what the money illusion conceals is the relationship between that number and what it actually buys you in the real economy, in groceries, in heating costs, in the monthly cash flow required to service the debt attached to that asset. For the average household, this means the illusion is about to be replaced by arithmetic. A home that is worth $800,000 on paper but requires a monthly payment of $3,150 to hold, a payment that now exceeds what the household income can comfortably service, is not an asset in any functional sense. It is a liability with a pleasant assessment notice attached to it. The bank does not share in your emotional connection to that property. The bank does not care that you painted the kitchen, that your children grew up in that house, that it represents 15 years of financial sacrifice. The bank is a creditor. It holds a lien. And CIBC's quiet workforce restructuring, its loan loss provisions, its internal recalibration, these are the visible evidence that on the other side of the transaction, the creditor is already preparing for what the debtor has not yet accepted. This is the moment the scaffolding comes down. And this is where what I call the normalcy bias becomes the most dangerous force in the room. Human beings are hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. We construct our financial plans, our spending habits, our sense of what is affordable based on the conditions we have lived through, not the conditions that are arriving. The Canadian homeowner who signed at 1.5% in 2021 did not build their household budget around 4.5%. They built it around 1.5% because that was the reality they inhabited for the years in which the plan was formed. Normalcy bias does not make them foolish. It makes them human. But the financial system does not grade on a curve for being human. The renewal notice does not come with an empathy adjustment. The payment is what the payment is. And the gap between what was expected and what is now required is where the financial damage lives. This is not theoretical, it's math. Here is what the great repricing actually means, because that is the correct name for what is coming, not a correction, not an adjustment, not a normalization, a repricing, a fundamental structural reassessment of what Canadian housing costs, what Canadian debt service requires, and what Canadian household balance sheets can actually bear when tested against a real-world interest rate rather than an emergency pandemic accommodation. The repricing does not ask permission. It does not consult with the homeowner's retirement timeline. It simply arrives, expressed as a renewal offer, and the household either absorbs it or it does not. And here's the part that should genuinely concentrate the mind. The banks are not victims of this repricing. They are architects of the response to it. CIBC's report is not an act of public service. It is a signal, a carefully calibrated communication to the market, to regulators, to institutional investors, that the bank has assessed the landscape, has run the actuarial models, and is now repositioning its balance sheet accordingly. When a major Canadian bank publishes a report warning that payment shock will double, what it is also communicating in the language that financial professionals read between the lines is that the bank has already decided how it intends to behave when that shock arrives. It is building the legal infrastructure. It is staffing the restructuring units. It is writing the internal playbooks for the wave of renewals that its own data tells it will produce distress. The bank is prepared. The question is whether you are, because what comes next is a binary choice, and I want to be direct about what that choice actually involves, because the financial media tends to soften it in ways that remove its urgency. The choice is not between a good outcome and a slightly less good outcome. It is between two fundamentally different relationships to the 2026 renewal wall. On one side of that divide are the households that look at the data right now, not in 2026, not when the renewal notice arrives, not when the payment has already been adjusted, but right now, in the window before the wall arrives, and make aggressive, uncomfortable, structurally significant changes to their financial position. They pay down principal, they build liquidity reserves, they have the difficult conversation with their lender about fixed rate options, about extending amortizations, about what restructuring looks like before it becomes mandatory. They treat the warning in CIBC's report as actionable intelligence rather than background noise. And here is the part that should concentrate the mind. On the other side of that divide are the households operating under normalcy bias, the ones who read the headline, feel briefly unsettled, and then return to the assumption that something will intervene, that the Bank of Canada will cut deeply enough, that home prices will hold, that the employment situation will remain stable, that the renewal, when it comes, will somehow be manageable. This is not a character flaw. This is the default human response to a threat that is real but not yet immediate. But the window between not yet immediate and already arrived is closing. This is vanishing in real time. We don't have months. This is happening in days. The resolution I am offering you today is not a product. It is a reframe. It is the insistence that you look at your household balance sheet, not through the lens of what was true in 2021, but through the lens of what will be true in 2026. It is the refusal to participate in the collective fiction that the renewal wall is someone else's problem, that the subprime creep stops at the subprime borrower, that the 44% delinquency surge in Ontario is a regional anomaly rather than a preview, The data does not support comfort, and the function of what we do here, the reason friends gather in spaces like this one, is to ensure that the people paying attention are not blindsided by what the people not paying attention will experience as a sudden shock. But this isn't even the part that scares me. What concerns me most deeply is not the 2026 renewal cohort, as severe as that event will be. What concerns me is the second order consequence, the repricing of what Canadian housing is worth when the full extent of the payment shock is priced into buyer behavior. Because the buyer who would have purchased your property in 2024, the buyer whose purchasing power was calculated at a 5.25% stress test qualification, is not the same buyer who exists in a 2026 environment of rising delinquencies, tightening credit, deteriorating consumer confidence, and a Gen Z cohort already stretched to its limit. The demand side of the housing equation is being quietly dismantled at the same moment the supply side is being flooded by distressed sellers. That intersection, distressed supply meeting constrained demand, is what produces not a correction, but a repricing. And a repricing does not announce itself in advance. It simply becomes the new price. The data forces one conclusion. So let me leave you with this. The banks have run their models. CIBC has published its warning. The Bank of Canada has its renewal data. The institutional machinery is already in motion, already repositioning, already preparing for the wave. The question that history will ask, and that you can answer right now before the question becomes academic, is whether you prepared when you still had the agency to do so, or whether you waited for the renewal notice to arrive and discovered that your options had already been foreclosed. History favors the prepared, and the window for preparation is closing, not in some theoretical future, not in the language of probability and forecast, but in 2026, on a specific Tuesday, when a specific email arrives with a specific number on it. The scaffolding is already showing its fault lines. The edifice is under stress. The canaries have sung. What you do with that information right now, in the weeks and months before the wall arrives, that is entirely within your control. That is the only variable that remains open. Everything else has already been decided by the math, and the math does not forgive delay.